David, there have been a lot of developments in the Canadian news over the past week relative to China. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you. You know, it's also, today is our first day, just shortly after last week's show, David, the Jason Goodman YouTube channel received a strike from the malicious social engineers who are constantly trying to shut this operation down. So it's very important today that people watching us share the video, like the video, and join us on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, or subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. We're going to be doing our sponsor exclusive show in just 1 hour on those channels. But David, there's a lot to discuss today having to do with Huawei, compromised nodes in East Asia, Cameron Ortis, Bob Paulson, the Trudeau family, and Huawei. Where would you like to begin?
Well, I always like to begin with your wonderful collage because there's characters there that maybe a lot of people don't recognize. Left to right, you've got Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is a former Prime Minister of Canada, who had quite an interesting career after getting kicked out of officer training school in Quebec for indiscipline. Really? He's a personally wealthy individual, and he goes off on a grand tour which takes him to Harvard, the Sorbonne, and the London School of Economics, where he gets a good grounding in British Fabianism. And then he comes back via, I believe, his Ba'ath Party contacts in Syria and Iraq.
What?
Fetches up. Sorry?
Wait a minute. I didn't know he had Ba'ath Party contacts. That leads right to Saddam Hussein.
Correct. And the particular nature of the Ba'ath Party, which I think we're starting to see in the formation of maybe a supranational government party in North America, where to get anywhere with the Ba'ath Party, first of all, you had to prove that you were totally loyal to the party. And then after that, you had to prove that you were totally loyal to Saddam Hussein. That is, if you wanted to survive and flourish, right? And that model is a very powerful technique for infiltration of conventional parties, including in Canada and the United States. And in my opinion, that's being implemented right now. So a few other dates for Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau. In 1952, he led the Canadian Communist Party delegation to Moscow to a conference. So I presume he would have met Communist Party leaders from the United States. And this wasn't the beginning by any means of the conspiracy, but I think it was a key step in developing the tools for ultimately what I see now as an attempted coup d'etat. So 1968, he becomes briefly the president of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada, which is the interface between the Prime Minister and I guess you could say Parliament, immensely powerful position, and a great opportunity, of course, to modify the foreign policy of a country such as Canada, which is now closely aligned to the interests of the China, People's Liberation Army and so on. But anyway, so moving on.
You just said something very important that I want to move past yet. So when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the head of the Canadian Communist Party and he went to Moscow, there's somebody else who's come into this story and come to our attention just in the past week. And I was speaking with Lee Stranahan about this on High Dive with Lee Stranahan. We're talking about Bill Browder, and his father was the head of the American Communist Party. So I've been trying to determine if Earl Browder and Pierre Trudeau ever hung out and knew each other. But the reason why this has captured my attention is that we just discovered last week that Bill Browder was tweeting about Cameron Ortis just as he was arrested. And apparently Browder called in some kind of complaint to the RCMP that got Cameron Ortis involved in this money laundering investigation surrounding the Magnitsky murder or death or whatever it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you lie down with the dogs, you wake up with the fleas. So gradually, the Communist Party leaders and theoreticians, etc., many of them embedded in our post-secondary institutions, eventually you pick up a leitmotif, an objective, and these guys all start getting into sync. And the great danger is if you equip them with the kind of technology that I believe they had at the time of 9/11, you can put a credible attempt together to overthrow the government of the United States. But I digress. So if we go back to Trudeau, in 1981, I was at the IJCAI conference in Vancouver, and it appears that Pierre Trudeau was transferring artificial intelligence and signals intelligence technologies to the Communist Chinese as fast as he could after he had met the heads of the Chinese Communist Party in China, I think in Beijing, in 1973. So one of the photographs you've shown historically on our show is him shaking hands with Mao Zedong. There wasn't a dictator he didn't admire, but to shake hands with Mao Zedong, probably the most successful, if that's the right word, genocidal leader of the 20th century, possibly or probably responsible for 80 million dead. So Pierre Trudeau really should never have got anywhere near his prime minister status because of the damage he's done to the country, which may be irreversible, but we don't need to give up yet. But in 1981, I believe he was transferring AI tracking technology to the Chinese because this is the key, modern key, to a revolution. You need to track all of the counter-revolutionaries and the police through the prison systems and so on in order to make sure that you're in a position to quell dissent. And a classic example of that was by the time of 1989 in Tiananmen Square, I believe they had used AI technology actually developed in British Columbia, regrettably, perhaps picking up some of the techniques I presented to IJCAI 81 to track all of the people. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, we will defeat your revolution by leading it.
Well, of course.
I believe that actually British Columbia played a key role in tricking the leaders of the revolutionary movement, or let's just call it a protest movement, into Tiananmen Square, where they could be bottled up and killed in large numbers. Whoa. And then their relatives persecuted, some of them executed and put in jail. But that's classical socialism, right? At its finest. And one of the problems for America is that there was a representative or a co or founder investor in the CAI private equity group that actually had its quarters in building number 7. That was where it was founded in New York, by the name of General Alexander Haig. So 4 months after the Tiananmen Square massacre, for which no one has been punished, because I think that was a criminal attack on the citizens of China by these insiders, he's, shaking hands with the Chinese president and saying, I guess all is forgiven. And he also, yes, Haig is, accelerating the transfer of Canadian, American, Five Eyes defense technologies and signals intelligence to the Chinese at about the time Huawei was founded. I think Huawei was founded in, 1988 by a former deputy director of the China People's Liberation Army Information Technology Research Unit. And he's the father of this woman, Meng Wanzhou.
But David, here's Haig in China. Who's he with?
Well, there you go, right?
Peking, China, June 16th. Haig meets China's top leader. Secretary of State Alexander Haig Jr. shook hands with China's top leader, Vice Chairman Deng Xiaoping. Tuesday, Deng said Haig had a very good session in talks Monday with China. Foreign Minister about Taiwan and international affairs.
Right. So now, just moving over to Justin Trudeau. So Justin Trudeau was born in 71. He arrives in Vancouver, and there's a missing 4 years. Maybe someone can help me fill in those years. But they're very important missing years because I think Trudeau may, with his friend and former roommate Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, have been tasked with setting up an international pedophile ring to connect the compromised nodes being infiltrated into the Five Eyes Federal Bridge Certification Authority, which would allow them, ultimately, those compromised nodes to be, how shall I put it, blackmailed or extorted or entrapped into keeping their mouths shut as these big attacks develop. For example, the attack on the United States East African embassies, or the USS Cole, or 911 itself. So the timing here is exquisite, because basically I would say that from 1994 until he signs on as a student at UBC, i.e. 1998, Justin Trudeau has 4 years with what the French call the piston from his father, who died in 2000, to basically infiltrate an international pedophile ring into the Five Eyes intelligence network and start connecting up all of the compromised nodes that we often look at on that schematic, that includes the Ministry of Defense and the Department of Justice and the state of Illinois and Boeing and Lockheed Martin.
It also irritates ethical hackers, David.
Which absolutely, and the reason for that is, it's very obvious to me now, is if you can put a compromised node into Boeing and Lockheed Martin and the state of Illinois and the Department of Justice, and then opportunistically, if that's the right word, get a hacker to link one compromised node to another compromised node without the knowledge and consent, let's say, of Boeing directors, you could suddenly switch those compromised nodes through Entrust public key infrastructure into let's call it a parallel narrative. So during a war game, like Amalgam Virgo of June the 1st to the 2nd of 2001, or Global Guardian or Global Custodian of the 10th of September to the 12th of September, you suddenly have a war game going rogue thanks to artificial intelligence algorithms that switch an exercise into the real thing. So now, the extraordinary thing about the technology that perhaps I pioneered in many ways, that you can take action at a distance, I believe at 1981, Pierre Trudeau was transferring AI tracking technologies to the Communist Chinese so they could be used, for example, to track potential victims through Tiananmen Square. And then his son, Justin Trudeau, from 1994 to 1998, was developing an international pedophile ring to compromise nodes in the Five Eyes networks. And all it needed for that synchronized attack on 911 was to have a Huawei agent come into Vancouver, that's the Meng Wanzhou, and coordinate these compromised nodes through the parallel narrative attacks of 911. So the beauty, going back to your collage, you've got Meng Wanzhou. She arrives and gets a permanent resident status in Vancouver, in Canada, right, in 2001. Just as, I guess, Trudeau and his best friend roommate had perfected, that's probably the wrong word, but instantiated an international pedophile ring involving infiltration of key nodes necessary to pull off the 911 attack. Now, over on the right, you have Bob Paulson, former RCMP commissioner, who was the non-commissioned officer in charge in southwest British Columbia during the Picton pig farm murders and the raid on Starnet. And he's the guy who fast-tracked Cameron Ortis into his position as the first civilian director of intelligence for the RCMP. So we've got the fascinating possibility is, did Justin Trudeau and Bob Paulson decide that probably the most effective and knowledgeable counter-espionage agent in Canada's history, Cameron Ortis, did they find that following his thesis on bowing to Quirinus, compromised nodes and cybersecurity in East Asia, did they find that he was about to expose their network, right? And so preemptively, they put him behind bars and are holding him, in my opinion, incommunicado, such that he will not reveal that the Canadian intelligence services and the other Five Eyes countries' intelligence services have all been infiltrated by compromised nodes where the individuals inside them are being extorted or blackmailed through an international pedophile ring into keeping their mouths shut, or basically being silence or consent to for example, the spreading of the digital COVID virus. Over to you.
Yeah. And, David, it seemed to me that Ortis's attorney was reluctant to speak to us. I mean, he said as much. He said he's not ready to speak to the press, but just his tone and temperament seemed to indicate that there just seems to be a lot of strange things around this case. Now, I haven't followed this too closely, but I'm sure you know, David, why is it that RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson chose to resign?
Well, I don't know what his age is. I mean, he's getting on a bit, but certainly you'd think he doesn't look particularly ancient there. I'm 77 and I can continue to function, I think, reasonably effectively. It doesn't look like he spent 32 years with the force, last 5 years, and that was 2017. Well, it may be, I mean, there's a variety of reasons he wants to spend more time with his family, but it may be they need to remove key people who might be seen to be an obstacle to keeping Cameron Ortis in jail, right? Because maybe then people will start getting suspicious that Cameron Ortis has not been put in jail because he's sharing secrets with the enemies of the Five Eyes countries, but he's been put in jail because he's discovered that Justin Trudeau has been sharing secrets with the enemies of the Five Eyes countries, particularly China. Because go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, that seems to be corroborated by Ezra Levant's reporting, where, the China files are telling us that Trudeau has invited Chinese military into Canada to do cold weather training and certainly puts them in very close proximity to the United States.
Well, I think what's fascinating about what you and I do, I believe, is that we can, partly my experience, we can burrow into the patent office and find very interesting tools that might connect a conspiracy so monstrous the average individual cannot believe it exists. That's quoting J. Edgar Hoover. So what occurred to me, I've been watching, what you're experiencing in New York. I mean, these people, as I understand it now, they're having pool parties in Wuhan City where no one's wearing any mask, and they're celebrating. And basically, while the traditional enemies of the Chinese Communist Party, the Five Eyes countries, I guess, their economies are imploding, and those jobs that are disappearing, they're not coming back. And there's the most extraordinary opportunity for dictatorship at the city level or the state level to tell people how close they should get together and how frequently they should wash their hands. There's never been a degree of control that could have been anticipated by the Russians or the Soviet Union or China that now exists in the United States. And the public, I mean, a few of them are standing out. But most people, I mean, it's the willing suspension of disbelief. I put on my mask because it's socially unacceptable not to, but I'm looking at little old people, Canadians, wandering around outside with the mask on. So they're recycling their air. It's incredibly unhealthy, but I digress. So how would they or could they have used artificial intelligence tracking techniques to get people to accept this level of control over their lives? So let me offer you a possibility. If we take the Contagion documentary by the BBC, you will know that they created some artificial intelligence algorithms to spread a digital virus on a cell phone. So if you were volunteered to participate in that pandemic exercise, there's Dr. Hannah Fry, very striking looking woman, and the app, which was the BBC Pandemic. They had a exercise in Hazelmere, which is a little town in southern England, where a number of people volunteered to carry one of these cell phones with the app. And Hannah Fry announced at the beginning of that Contagion documentary, which is fascinating. When I first saw it, I found it quite compelling. Now, in retrospect, I find it incredibly dangerous.
Did you see it, David, before the pandemic or after?
Oh, yes. No, after. Right. It was drawn to my attention. Right. And so I thought, wow, isn't that fascinating? The BBC is ahead of the curve. They've actually modeled and simulated the spread of this virus. And I watched it. And then I realized is the digital virus that hops from cell phone to cell phone has got nothing to do with the physical virus that hops from one human to another. So if you make your decisions based on the algorithms that tell you how fast this might spread if you don't wash your hands, and that appears as an example, you're going to make decisions based on, how shall I put it, a fake narrative. So this woman is a real character, but she's participating in a fake narrative. The real narrative, which would describe how this real virus is being spread, has got nothing to do with the fake narrative of how the digital virus is being spread. And here's an interesting theory that I've been developing. With the fake narrative and the fake virus, you're actually developing what I call the digital dead, the people or the identities that die from the fake virus and the fake narrative. So you've now got a pool of fake dead, or, in this fake narrative. So as the infection spreads around North America into the various states, the BBC in real time is producing figures about the number of people who have A, caught COVID-19, and B, who've died from it. But what I believe now, my theory is that the BBC is injecting fake data through a fake virus in a fake narrative to influence perceptions of the American people in the different states such that they couldn't reconcile the indifference of President Trump to what I believe he saw as a fake virus and a fake narrative. So the idea of the BBC and the people driving this, how shall I put it, what I think might be a Dominion coup d'etat, is to vote against Trump because he's not paying enough attention to the fake virus. However, I don't think they succeeded. This is my prediction. I believe there was actually a landslide, I can't prove it, towards Trump in a number of key states. And they needed to inject the digital dead from the BBC's COVID models into the Dominion voting machine.
David, I don't know that that's had a significant impact. Everything has indicated that, although there are, in every election, indications that dead names appear on the rolls, I don't know that it's been of a significant enough amount that it would impact the election.
Well, now, remember, if you could just show the Dominion voting patent, right, which has the phrase at the title, electronic correction of voter-marked paper ballots. Now, that should, just to answer your question, what that means with this patent is you can inject an electronic identity and correction into the paper ballot, and you don't need to modify the paper ballot. What I think they've been focused on is the idea that someone comes in with a box of paper ballots that have been illegally presented. But the electronic correction of voter-marked paper ballots after the ballots have been closed would show up, and I'm not saying it's fraud, but would show up in that violation of Benford's law. That is to say, in any data that's coming in from 4 or 5 orders of magnitude, which might be 100, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000, the first digit of the data coming in, if it's randomly spread, is 30% of the time is 1, and 5% of the time is 9. So typically you would see the profile of, starting with 30% down to 5% between 1 and 9. But there's something very interesting with the voting in this last election, it appears in a number of states that you have an anomaly, which is an anomaly under Benford's law, which suggests electronic injection of identities, not the paper injection. Over to you.
Well, just in reading the abstract, let's do it, because I think it's often it helps us understand a little bit better of what exactly this thing is either trying to do or trying to convince us that it's not doing. This is the patent for electronic correction of voter-marked paper ballots, and the abstract tells us that it's a collection of methods and systems and devices are described for electronically correcting votes made on voter-marked paper ballots. An optical scan system may image a paper ballot and allow vote modification by the voter following the imaging. So it says may image and it may allow. It doesn't say it will allow. It may allow. And courts have interpreted that word may to also mean may not. So, for example, such a modification may be necessary, for example, if a voter has improperly voted. Okay, then it gives some examples, but it's not limited to this set of examples. Just some examples offered are if they voted for two candidates for one office. I would think also if they've voted for a non-existent candidate, like misspelling the word Republican, that would be considered the wrong candidate. So if a definitive determination of the intention to cast a vote cannot be made, if a write-in candidate is included on the ballot, or if a voter has changed their mind or otherwise wishes to cast a different vote than initially indicated. So wait a minute now. So they're just saying the modification may be necessary if a write-in candidate is on the ballot, or if they change their mind or otherwise wishes to cast. It's a lot of circumstances, but after the correction, the corrected ballot may be re-imaged. It just, I don't know. What do you think of that, David?
Well, it's absurd. I mean, because basically there's no evidence that the voter, after shoving his or her voter marked paper ballot into this machine, that the machine doesn't, programmed remotely by artificial intelligence algorithms, conclude that that voter has voted for the wrong candidate.
Well, we have a real-world example of how that could occur. There was someone, I think it's Code Monkey Z on Twitter, who's been raising a lot of important IT-type concerns. He's saying that what could be done is the word Republican could be typed in a computer by a human setting up this voting machine saying, okay, the Republican candidate is Donald Trump. You could spell Republican instead of with a lowercase l, you could spell it with a capital I. And then when humans looking at that typed information on the computer see it, it looks like an L because a capital I and a lowercase l are just a line. But the computer, when you go to vote for that person, let's say the voting machine has it spelled wrong and the tabulator has it spelled correctly, it will see this is a candidate that doesn't exist. Donald Trump, the Repub-E-Can. So that gets thrown out and it needs to be corrected. Somebody voted for the wrong candidate.
And the voter walks away from the ballot box, right, thinking that they voted for Trump, but the machine goes through this, what it is described in the abstract it can do, converts that to Biden, and then inserts, and then, I don't know, there could be a shredder down below the machine.
Yeah, it could eliminate it and offer the voter. This patent doesn't go into the details of what happens if there's a discrepancy and they cannot determine what the voter's intention was. This abstract tells us that if a voter has improperly voted, if a definitive determination of the intention to cast a vote cannot be made, if, it's all these things. So where's the then part of this?
Well, exactly. So the then is the vote. The voter walks away thinking that he's voted for Trump or she's voted for Trump. The machine produces a new ballot. It's been re-imaged, right? So there's a new ballot that shows up in the more of the machine. So you can look at it, and basically it's a vote for Biden. But the anomaly, and that's what's so fascinating about this, is with the Benford's law, which is violations of that are a clue to, but not proof of, fraud. But when forensic accountants go through the books or shareholders' books or whatever, looking for these kind of anomalies, a Benford's law anomaly or Benford's law violation is a clue that there is something wrong. Now, apparently, I mean, we actually put out a couple of shows ago, or one of the previous collages, you showed the Benford's law anomaly associated with the votes for Biden, which indicate, and very interestingly, apparently Facebook and Twitter, if anyone pointed that out, it was considered to be, what was it, sexually abusive?
I don't know.
And the accounts were being suspended.
They have all kinds of reasons to suspend the accounts. But David, you know, our viewers in the chat are reminding me of something I saw earlier this morning. The Department of Defense has suspended security briefings with former Vice President Joe Biden. And there's a lot of speculation as to what that exactly means. Let's see what the Washington Post says about it. That's interesting that it took me here. Jonathan Swan is with Axios, and he's got a scoop. Acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller ordered a Pentagon-wide halt to cooperation with the transition of Joe Biden. Shocking. Officials across the Defense Department, senior administrators tell Axios. But
well, Pep, so just in that's fascinating information, and I hadn't heard it before. But maybe people are listening to us. Could you just flip to the schematic? You know, with possibly, if you can find it, the one where the two Trudeaus are meeting a previous and the current premier or president of the China. Anyway, yeah, because
that's not a schematic. That's
one, you have a collage with the people. But anyway, that's all right. For example, I think it's absolutely vital that what's left of the intelligence service of the United States starts to understand that this federal bridge network, which, as you can see, connects the Department of Defense with the UK MOD, has been infiltrated with compromised nodes that I believe are compromised by virtue of being associated with an international pedophile ring set up by Justin Trudeau and his roommate. Yeah, that's the one. I think that's an incredibly powerful one, and one day will serve to actually bring their house of cards down. Yeah, over on the right above Justin Trudeau's head, you will see the two curves associated with the returns or votes for Trump and the returns or vote for Biden. Now, I don't know the authenticity of that data, but what we're led to believe is the one on the right is consistent with voting for Trump, which was going along a curve as the results came in that indicated a landslide for Trump in the swing states. So the conspirators, which I allege include Justin Trudeau and Meng Wanzhou, right, the daughter of the founder of Huawei, desperately needed to get some votes surreptitiously switched to Biden. And this patent, the Dominion patent, which incidentally was issued at the time and still is, that Serco was running the United States Patent and Trademark Office and would have given or could have given access to this patent to the conspirators. So I believe they injected digital identities, possibly borrowed from the COVID database that the BBC had put together. So they injected the digital dead into this patent and swung the votes over to Biden. So now, if that is correct, and I believe it to be so, then I think the Pentagon's and the Defense Department is well advised to cease cooperating with the transition team, because I think the transition team has been totally penetrated by Huawei. Over to you.
Well, and there's other indicators of things happening with China. It's now been revealed that the Department of Justice is in fact investigating Hunter Biden for all of his crack smoking China dealings that were revealed on the laptop. So now former Vice President Joe Biden is being put in the position of having to answer questions from stupid comedians about how much crack his son smoked while he was getting paid millions of dollars from China. But I want to go back to the collage, David, because we got Meng Wanzhou pictured there, but there's an elephant in the room, David. It's this Peter Nygard jet sitting in the background, and I try to put a lot of thought. I guess this is a bit on the heavy-handed side to explain the subtlety of something, but what I've done, David, is I've framed the key feature of the Boeing Super 727 that I think makes it of interest to people like Peter Nygard and Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein, and that is the rear stairs, framed right there in between Justin Trudeau and Meng Wanzhou. Justin Trudeau has been asked many times about Huawei and Meng Wanzhou, and he's been pretty tight-lipped about it. I don't know if American viewers are as well informed about this detail as Canadians, and Justin Trudeau has been reluctant to say anything about her, despite China essentially taking hostage 2 Canadian citizens.
Well, he's desperate, in my opinion, to try and look statesperson-like for Canada and do a swap between Meng Wanzhou and the 2 incarcerated Canadians in China. The problem he faces is, I think we can pat ourselves on the back, is I think we can now identify a strong probability that when Meng Wanzhou arrived in Vancouver in 2001, she met with or liaised with Justin Trudeau in linking the international pedophile ring that he had created, probably with Starnet and the Piggy Palace Good Time Society, and made sure that the Nortel equipment and systems that Huawei had stolen, resulting actually in the collapse of Nortel. But by 1995 or 1996, I think Huawei controlled all of Nortel's operations around the world. But Nortel in 2001 outsourced the installation of its fiber optic and wireless and data networks to 2 companies that are absolutely vital to understanding the cover-up of 911. Those 2 companies are AMEC and Bovis. Now, AMEC had an office above Starnet Communications, right? And Bovis, interestingly, built the Trump Hotel, I think, in Chicago, upgraded the Statue of Liberty, and built the 911 Memorial in New York. So I believe through Huawei communication systems, Bovis and AMEC were primed to remove all of the evidence of Huawei's role and Justin Trudeau's role in the 911 attacks. Because within a few hours, instead of a yellow tape, and the scale of the problem is so enormous, it's hard to get your head around. But this was never a terrorist act. It was a criminal act, both in New York and in Washington, D.C., right? And what should have happened, although it would have required a lot of tape, is to put a yellow tape around the crime scene, and no one gets in and out, consistent with humanitarian relief and the recovering of the injured, etc., to keep the evidence and the custody of the evidence intact. So the people knew that in order to get away with this, which I think was an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States, particularly focused in Washington and New York, the number one objective was to get the evidence away from the real investigators and make sure that the crime scene investigators, including presumably the FBI and the CIA, etc., would be neutered because they were operating with a compromised node within their ranks, which quite possibly had got to the most senior people in the FBI and the CIA. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, David, I'm glad you brought up Starnet Communications, because there are people who I see in the chat who are regular viewers who I guess have missed our statements about this, because the question is, what is so significant about the rear stairs on this Boeing 727? But it's not just the rear stairs. We've spoken about it many times, but I want to say it again for people who don't know. The Boeing 727 is the least common aircraft type ever manufactured by Boeing. Less than 2,000, I think less than 1,500 of these jets were ever made. So there's fewer parts available, there's fewer pilots that are trained to operate this type, fewer mechanics around the world that can fix it. And by contrast, introduced just 4 years after the 727 in 1967, the Boeing 737 is the most common commercial jet aircraft ever manufactured. So it doesn't make sense to me that multimillionaires like Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Nygard would both choose to fly such an old, rare, outdated aircraft type that is inefficient and just makes no sense. People have said, oh, well, you know, they want a mechanical jet, so it can't be taken over by the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot. That could be achieved with the 737 as well. The unique feature of the 727 is its ability to open this rear door in flight. If the plane slows down to just a speed just above its stall speed and lowers its altitude below 1 atmosphere where the cabin doesn't require pressurization, this door could be opened in flight, perhaps over an ocean where there are holes in the radar coverage that you've discussed with regard to the Malaysian flights. You could drop whatever you want out of the back of that. A dead person, a live person, drugs, any kind of contraband, bombs, whatever. So it's here because it's strange to me that Peter Nygard has just been arrested for substantially the same crimes as Jeffrey Epstein. They both fly the same type of jet. We've looked at that video where Peter Nygard has a stripper pole inside his jet with the CIA compass rose at the base of it. And David, I've included something even more subtle than the framed stairs in this collage. I wonder if you've caught it or if any of the rest of the audience has caught it. Did you see this?
Yeah, I saw that.
To commit the perfect crime, David, you don't have to be smart. There's a second half of this that I'm going to reveal right now, and I'm glad that you brought up StarNet Communications because it's something that you and I speak about frequently and something that we've visited right there in Vancouver. A person on the street, without hesitation, told us that this mural, despite whatever the official story is for how it got there, the guy on the street who seemed to know what he was talking about said that this was a warning. And I'm not seeing it right. Oh, no, there it is. I don't know if you can see this little thing right here that is a sort of a pin dropped by Google Earth, but it says drugs mural. And I think for a time we presumed that it was talking about this painted on the wall here. But I discovered, David, last night that that is not it at all. It's talking about, I believe, this mural painted, we can't really see it from here, but I've downloaded it, and here it is. And it's painted on the wall right there, and it says, to commit the perfect crime, you don't have to be smart, you just have to be in charge.
Interesting. CIA.
I found that appropriate.
Now, incidentally, just while you've got that, so with that raid on StarNet on 20th of August 1999, probably coordinated by Bob Paulson,
right,
150 law enforcement officers showed up, including people or representatives or agents from the CIA, the FBI, US Customs, and the IRS, and in Canada, the RCMP, Vancouver Police Department, and the high-tech squad from Ottawa. And they took away all of the evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries.
And the equipment, the servers, the computers.
To go quite possibly on one of these planes or some of them.
Or both.
You have a fleet of 727s that are connected in the air. It's like, the E-4Bs, the big Boeing aircraft with that revolving disc. But you now have a criminal group that is in command, perhaps, of compromised nodes embedded in the Five Eyes signals intelligence network, including, let me just hypothetically say, the Department of Justice. Because, for example, in 1994, Clinton gives a blessing to an organization called DOJ Pride, which represents the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered community in the FBI and the CIA, the Bureau of Prisons, and Office of Justice Programs. And I can only assume that that would be a target for a compromised node, because if you can get people to make decisions about whether to investigate or drop an investigation based on sexual orientation, haven't you got inside the very heart of the justice system of the United States? Over to you.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that's what they're trying to do, is to infiltrate all of this stuff. I'm trying to find an article right now because I don't want people to think that we're just like haphazardly putting this stuff together. There are elements of evidence to support this hypothesis, and the removal of this equipment, we're talking about a number of different news stories that sort of just end. And I want to bring it back to Cameron Ortis because I've been following this thread where I'm particularly interested when multiple guests on Crowdsource the Truth who don't know each other and don't communicate, when they start talking about things that intersect, that I think is where the magic happens. And I was speaking with Lee Stranahan about Bill Browder, and Bill Browder is a guy that Lee knows quite a lot about. And the thing that really kind of bowled me over was right at the time that Cameron Ortis was arrested, Bill Browder put out this tweet. And Bill Browder is this like super rich guy who, Putin wants to stick in jail. I mean, he's busy. Why is he sitting around tweeting? He's got to have a purpose. And he writes, "Unbelievable. Cameron Ortis, the Canadian law enforcement official heading up the money laundering investigation connected to the Magnitsky murder, was arrested last night in Ottawa for alleged espionage and working with a foreign power. Same thing happened in Switzerland." And the report about what happened in Switzerland is only reported in Fox News. I cannot find any other information about this Mr. K person anywhere. And it's connected to the Russian lawyer who was at the Trump Tower meeting, which is Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was, had lured Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and a couple of other people to talk about the Magnitsky Act, which, that meeting was a key part of the Russia investigation. And we can't find anything about this Mr. K except for this report on Fox News, and Fox News seems to love Bill Browder. It's a false narrative.
Well, I think what's happening here, and that's the original title of this part of the show, is Has Cameron Ortis been set up? Now, I think if you judge from the PhD thesis that was supervised by Professor Brian Jobe up at UBC, this guy is a very, very sharp guy, and he was describing an existing state of affairs. That is, in his title it says, bowing to Quirinus, which is an authority god, sort of Roman cult god, before the formation of the Roman Empire, if you will, or the state, compromised nodes, and cybersecurity in East Asia. So Cameron Ortis is looking backwards in time when he wrote this thesis, and I think he's looking at compromised nodes linked through an international pedophile ring and high technology or artificial intelligence set up by Justin Trudeau and Meng Wanzhou, right? And as he got closer and closer to exposing this, the people who are running these networks, on your mural, you talk about who's in control. The people who are running this compromised node international pedophile ring realized, hell, this guy's getting too close. We'd better put him behind bars, right? But Cameron Ortis is very likely to have linked the pedophile rings operating in New York with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein with this Peter Nygard affair, and I don't know, the Savile operation, Jimmy Savile operations within the BBC. And he was starting to realize, this is pure speculation, that the compromised nodes were tied electronically using technology stolen by Huawei from Motorola and Cisco and Nortel, such that could expose the bigger conspiracy, which is the attempt, and I'm using the word dominion here, of a Dominion party to overthrow or recapture the United States of America. And Lee, I listened to the interview you had with Lee, and remember he mentioned Cecil Rhodes, didn't he?
Yes.
So I want to pick up on your point. I believe the people you interview, the next challenge for the people you have as guests is to bring us together, where Charles Ortel has his deep financial knowledge. Lee has this insight that includes a historical link back to the Rhodes Scholarship and Cecil Rhodes. And I think, is it Larry Klayman, may
Yeah,
be
he's a
able to
lawyer.
look at the way we get out of this. I think there's only one way, which is to launch, and I'm thinking of inviting the Allard School of Law to launch it, is a writ of habeas corpus to get the person who is the de facto custodian of Cameron Ortis in jail, which I think is Justin Trudeau, before Parliament. And remember, this is not just a security issue. It's been described as a sovereignty issue. So Americans should understand their sovereignty is under threat by an organization that is global. I call it Ijkai Murder Inc., and we can elaborate on that. But I think it would be extraordinary. Now, I've just got a few minutes here. You remember last week with the show, I kept stumbling, and of course this is again speculation, over the word habeas, right? Habeas
Yes.
as in bring the body. And I don't know if you remember that. And it struck me, why can't I go to the door in my mind, which is normally pretty formidable when I'm hunting for words? Why can't I find that word? And I have a metaphor, and maybe it's persuasive. I believe if we open the habeas corpus door and restore or reinvigorate that concept which goes back 800 years and is described as the crowning glory of Anglo-American common law, the rights of habeas corpus, I think when and if we can open that door, there will be an explosion of heat and energy that will dazzle us all. Because if we have Cameron Ortis and Justin Trudeau in front of Parliament, and I'm sure there is the equivalent in the United States Congress, you could pick someone who's been in jail and is not communicating to the outside world of greater value out of jail than in jail. And like, let's say, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Ramzi Youssef in the UK, wouldn't it be interesting if we could get Julian Assange in front of Parliament with his de facto jailers, which might be Serco, right? And answer those questions. And suddenly, I believe, the light would go on and we would recover an inalienable right of the writ of habeas corpus where anyone, because the prisoner might be held incommunicado, to seek on his behalf the evidence from his jailer that he's lawfully detained. And I don't think Justin Trudeau will be able to prove or demonstrate to a court of public opinion or a court with jurisdiction that Cameron Ortis is lawfully detained. Over to you.
Yeah, David, I selected this picture. I mean, it's so weird to me, these courtroom sketches, that they don't allow you to use a camera. But in contrast to most of the courtroom sketches we've seen of Cameron Ortis, where, I mean, they literally just look like cartoons, this one, the artist really seems to have captured his emotion, and he looks troubled. Obviously, anybody who's on trial for espionage would feel that way. But I mean, like, you look at this picture, I mean, this just looks like, frankly, a high school art student to me. Doesn't really seem to capture very much of anything. Similar to this, I mean, this is just like a cartoon picture of a villain. But I wanted to show that one because I just feel like, I don't know, something tells me that they've got Ortis and they're trying to keep him quiet. But we're going to continue
they
to
call that. Yes,
yeah.
sorry.
Call that
well, he's incommunicado. And again, that's, as I understand it, the basis of habeas corpus is because the prisoner is incommunicado, he's underrepresented or unrepresented at all. So it's now the duty, the obligation falls on his jailer, with de facto or de jure. I think de facto, it's Justin Trudeau. It would be Justin Trudeau and perhaps Bob Paulson, who between them, I think, set up a trap, maybe with a little influence from Huawei financiers, to get this guy behind bars so he couldn't deepen his PhD thesis analysis, this compromised node and cybersecurity in East Asia, because cybersecurity in East Asia has now overwhelmed the Five Eyes intelligence network through Huawei. And I believe that Meng Wanzhou was sent to Vancouver to coordinate the compromised nodes prior to the 9/11 attack through the two installers, which is Bovis and AMEC, to make sure with Justin Trudeau that as soon as those attacks had happened, evidence of what had happened would be taken away in a manner exactly like the raid on Starnet. Over to you.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like a cover-up, like so many of the other things that we've explored. And David, you've told us extensively how these parallel narratives are important to the cover-ups. Most recently, the Daily Mail ran a story about how a high-stakes gambler and FBI informant brought down Canadian spy chief who was secretly helping a cell phone encryption firm. It's strange to me, David, because when I think about international money laundering and crime, I find it, just on the surface without knowing the details, seems more likely that a high-stakes gambler would be involved in money laundering than a PhD, super genius who's rocketed to the top of law enforcement. But certainly anything is possible. David, we're out of time, so we're going to make our transition here over to the sponsor-exclusive segment. People can join us for the in-depth discussion of these and other topics on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. For people who are perhaps seeing us for the first time, don't forget to check out David's website, reverse-CSIscripts.com, and you can also follow David on Twitter. He is at CSI Hawkins. David, we've got over 500 people watching us right now. If only 70 of them follow you on Twitter, you'll hit the magic 1,000, and hopefully that will happen. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you